My name is Patricia Lawson, though most people call me Pat. I am 64 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who once believed my life would end in the quiet rhythms of classrooms, chalk dust, and the laughter of children. I never imagined that in my later years, my family, my own flesh and blood, would push me to the very edge of a canyon trail on Thanksgiving afternoon. Yet that is exactly where I found myself at 2:17 p.m., with my husband Harold gripping my hand so tightly his knuckles turned white, his breath ragged as he whispered in my ear, "Stay still. Not yet." The rocks beneath my shoes felt like they could give way at any second. The drop below was a yawning silence, swallowing sound and light as though the earth itself wanted to devour us. My son, Caleb, and his wife, Vanessa, stood just behind us, their faces painted with smiles, too wide, too sweet for the circumstance. They wanted a photograph, or so they claimed, but in the tremble of Harold's voice, I heard something far more chilling, the unspoken truth that our son was no longer our protector, but the one forcing us closer to the void. I remember the weight of the air pressing against my chest. The autumn wind tugged at my hair and carried with it the scent of pine needles and cold stone. For a fleeting second, I thought of Andrew, my firstborn, who had died in a canyon not unlike this one 25 years earlier. Back then, I clung to the explanation of an accident, because it was the only way I could survive the grief. But standing at the cliff's edge, Harold's whisper still echoing in my ear, I began to understand that what I had accepted as fate was something much darker, a truth I had been too afraid to face. My eyes caught Caleb's for the briefest moment. They were calm, almost rehearsed, as if this was not the first time he had stood in this role, the orchestrator of quiet ruin. And Vanessa, with her polished hair and flawless smile, had a gleam in her eyes that froze me more than the cold air ever could. It was the kind of look that told me we were not standing there by accident. In those seconds, I thought of my grandchildren, Ethan and Clara, still too young to understand the fractures running through our family. I thought of the kitchen table Harold had built with his hands when our boys were small, the same table where we had shared countless meals, birthdays, and the occasional quarrel. That table had always been solid, a symbol of what held us together, and yet here we were, about to be broken apart forever, not by time but by betrayal. The canyon did not roar, it did not threaten, it waited, patient and hungry. I felt Harold squeeze my hand again, grounding me, reminding me that this moment was not the end, not yet. I let out a slow breath, tasted the metallic fear on my tongue, and forced myself to remain still. Because sometimes survival is not in the scream or the struggle. It is in the silence, in the decision to wait one, more heartbeat before everything changes. You might think this is where my story ends, but it is only where the veil begins to tear. That afternoon on the cliff was not just about survival. It was about secrets Harold had carried for 25 years, secrets that would turn my understanding of family upside down. As soon as Caleb and Vanessa walked back a few steps, believing they had already won, Harold leaned toward me and with trembling lips revealed a truth darker than their betrayal. That moment split our lives in two, the world we thought we lived in, and the one we would uncover piece by piece. If you are still with me, you might already feel the same question that haunted me that day. How could a son, a boy I once cradled in my arms, lead us to the edge with steady hands and an empty heart? That is the journey I want to share with you. And if you stay until the end, perhaps you will understand not only what happened to us, but also why silence can be both a prison and a key. Before we walk further into this story, let me take a moment. Stories like this are never just mine. They belong to anyone who has felt betrayal claw its way into their family, anyone who has stood in silence when the ground shook beneath them. If you've ever carried wounds that no one else could see, this space is for you. Stay with me, listen closely, and if this story touches something within you, I invite you to walk alongside me. There is more to come, and I promise it will matter. When I close my eyes and force myself away from that cliff, I see a different time, a time when life felt steady, predictable, and full of small joys that I believed would never fade. Our home sat on the outskirts of a Wyoming town, a modest wooden house Harold and I had chosen together when we were young. It wasn't grand, but it carried the warmth of our work and our love. The kitchen walls smelled faintly of cedar from Harold's carpentry projects, and my own touch showed in the shelves of worn children's books that I refused to let go of, even after retirement. That house was more than lumber and nails. It was the stage where we raised our boys. I was a teacher for more than 30 years. My days used to be filled with chalk lines on blackboards, the sound of laughter in hallways, and little notes from children who believed I was their second mother. Harold worked as a carpenter, a man who could turn a raw plank into something lasting, something you could trust to hold the weight of life. At the end of each day, I would come home to the smell of sawdust on his shirt and supper on the table. Our life was not wealthy in money, but it was rich in rhythm and meaning. Andrew, our firstborn, was gentle from the very beginning. He had Harold's patience and a light in his eyes that softened every room he walked into. Even as a boy, he was the one who would stay behind after supper to help me with the dishes, or sit with his father in the workshop listening as Harold explained how to measure twice and cut once. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, of building bridges that could connect people across impossible distances. Caleb, our youngest, came into the world with fire in his veins. He was quick, sharp, and restless. While Andrew would spend hours sanding a piece of wood smooth, Caleb would run out into the fields, chasing anything that moved. He was bright, too bright sometimes, and always wanted more. More praise, more attention, more recognition. When Andrew won an award at school, Caleb's smile faltered even as he clapped. I noticed it, though I tried to brush it aside. Sibling rivalry, I told myself. Nothing more. Back then, I believed we had struck a balance. Andrew's calm steadied Caleb's storm, and Caleb's energy kept Andrew from disappearing into his books. They were two halves of a whole, I thought. Two boys who would grow into men who loved each other as fiercely as Harold and I loved them. Sundays were my favorite. We would gather at the wooden table Harold had built with his own hands. Andrew would bow his head, grateful for the meal, while Caleb teased him, trying to make him laugh before Grace was finished. I can still hear their voices rising and falling, one melodic, one insistent, both filling the room with life. We would eat cornbread and stew, the fire crackling nearby, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is what people mean when they talk about happiness. Of course, no family is without its cracks. Harold worked long hours, and sometimes his silence filled the spaces between us. I had my worries, too, about bills, about the future, about the little things Caleb said when he thought no one was listening. But those cracks seemed small compared to the whole. We were a unit, bound together by routines, memories, and the simple truth that we loved one another. Andrew, even as a teenager, carried responsibility like a second skin. He looked out for Caleb, even when Caleb did not want looking after. When Caleb got into fights at school, Andrew was the one who walked him home, his hand firm on his brother's shoulder. When Harold and I argued, Andrew was the one who would come sit beside me, his quiet presence a balm. There was a goodness in him that I thought would never be shaken. Caleb, for all his rough edges, had moments of tenderness too. He would carve little wooden figures when Harold wasn't looking, then leave them on my desk without a word. He loved fiercely, even if clumsily, and for every moment of jealousy, there were moments where he clung to Andrew like a lifeline. Looking back now, it is easy to see the seeds of what would come. The rivalry that never truly healed. The way Caleb's eyes lingered on what Andrew had. The silence Harold carried when he thought I wasn't watching. But in those days, I chose not to see it. I chose instead to hold on to the image of our family gathered in the living room, Andrew reading aloud from a book while Caleb sprawled across the rug pretending not to listen but hanging on every word. If I had known what lay ahead, the loss, the betrayal, the silence that would choke our family, I would have held tighter to those moments. I would have taken more photographs, written more things down, memorized every sound of my boys' laughter. Because once you lose it, you spend the rest of your life chasing it in echoes. The truth is, the family I thought we were died long before that afternoon on the canyon trail. It died in small pieces, splintering quietly until all that was left was the illusion of what had been. But for a while, we really did have it. A house filled with love, 2 boys who were my world, and a husband whose steady hands promised me we would always be safe. And maybe that is why the betrayal cuts so deep. Because to lose something, you first have to know what it feels like to have it. And we had it once. The memory of Andrew's death lives in me like a scar beneath the skin, tender to the touch even after 25 years. It was the spring of his senior year, a season when life should have been filled with possibility, with dreams too large for a small Wyoming town. He was 18, preparing to leave for college, and his acceptance letter to the University of Colorado sat neatly pinned to the refrigerator door. I remember the way he touched it every morning, almost reverently, as though afraid it might disappear if he didn't keep reminding himself it was real. The day he died began like any other. The air was sharp but warming, the snow receding from the mountainsides, leaving trails damp and dark with melting ice. Harold had spent the morning in his workshop, sanding the legs of a table he intended as a gift for Andrew's dorm room. I had been grading papers at the kitchen table, though my eyes often drifted toward the window where Andrew and Caleb stood by the truck, arguing in the driveway. It wasn't unusual. They were brothers, after all, and their arguments flared as often as they subsided. Still, something about their body language unsettled me. Andrew's arms folded tight, Caleb's fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. By afternoon, they had driven off together, saying they were headed for the canyon trail. Andrew wanted to take photographs, he explained, to capture the wild beauty before leaving for college. Caleb shrugged, trailing behind him, and I remember thinking how proud I was of Andrew for including his younger brother in what should have been his moment alone. That was who Andrew was, generous, forgiving, unwilling to leave anyone out. But when only Caleb returned hours later, his shirt stained with dust, his face blank in a way that chilled me to the marrow, I felt the ground tilt beneath me. "It was an accident," he said flatly. Andrew slipped. He fell. The world stopped. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the soft creak of Harold's boots as he rushed out the door, the sound of my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. I wanted to believe him. I had to believe him. The alternative was unbearable. We rushed to the canyon, the sheriff's truck already parked near the trailhead. The air was colder there, sharper, as though it had swallowed the warmth of the day along with my son. I remember the searchlights sweeping across the cliffs, the voices calling out Andrew's name, though I knew, deep in my bones, I would never hear his voice again. When they brought me his belongings, the camera strap torn, the lens shattered, I held them to my chest like they could bring him back. His body was found the next morning, broken against the rocks. They told me he had likely died instantly, that he hadn't suffered. But mothers know. We know when our children have been afraid, when their last moments were filled with terror instead of peace. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to follow him into that canyon and never come back. But Harold stood behind me, his hand steady on my shoulder, his eyes hollow with a grief so deep I thought it might consume him. We buried Andrew under a sky the color of ash, and I stood at his grave clutching Caleb's hand, telling myself that at least I still had one son left. But even then, something about Caleb unsettled me. He wept at the funeral, but the tears seemed forced, his sobs too measured, his eyes too dry the moment they left the gravesite. He didn't speak of Andrew in the days that followed, didn't linger in his room or leaf through his books. Instead, he avoided the subject entirely, as though Andrew had been erased. When I tried to ask him about that day, his answers were short, clipped, rehearsed. He slipped. I couldn't reach him. The words never changed, no matter how many times I asked, and every time I heard them, my heart fractured further, because something about his tone felt wrong. Harold, too, grew quieter after Andrew's death. He spent long hours in his workshop, the sound of hammering echoing into the night. He told me he was coping in his own way, but there was a shadow in his eyes I couldn't name. At times I would catch him looking at Caleb with something between suspicion and despair, but when I asked, he shook his head. "Let it rest, Pat," he would say, his voice rough. "Nothing good comes from digging where the earth has already closed." And so I did what mothers do. I swallowed my doubts. I clung to the belief that it had been a tragic accident, that God had taken my boy for reasons I would never understand. I folded Andrew's clothes neatly into boxes, placed his books on the highest shelf, and told myself it was better not to stir the ashes, but the silence ate at me. At night, I would hear echoes of Andrew's laughter in the hallway, see his shadow in the corner of my eye. I dreamed of him standing at the edge of the canyon, looking back at me with a question in his eyes. "Why didn't you ask harder? Why didn't you see?" Caleb moved on quickly, too quickly. He focused on school, on sports, on building a life that seemed to grow larger even as mine shrank to nothing. People praised him for his strength, his resilience. But I saw the way he avoided my gaze, the way he flinched when Andrew's name slipped into conversation. And though I never admitted it aloud, I began to wonder if the canyon had taken more than Andrew that day. Perhaps it had taken the last thread binding Caleb to us, leaving behind a boy who no longer belonged to the family we once were. Years passed, but the wound never closed. I carried Andrew's memory like a hidden letter folded deep in my pocket, worn at the edges but too precious to discard. Every holiday, every family photograph missing his face was another reminder of what had been stolen. And though I forced myself to smile for Caleb, to carry on for Harold, there was always a part of me that stood at that canyon, waiting for my boy to climb back up. If I had known then what Harold had seen, what he had chosen to bury in silence, perhaps I would have found the strength to demand answers. But I didn't. And that silence, that choice to believe in an accident rather than face the possibility of betrayal, would haunt me all the way to the edge of another cliff decades later. In the months after Andrew's death, our home became a place where silence grew like ivy, winding its way into every corner. The laughter that once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by the muffled creak of Harold's footsteps in the workshop and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For me, each day felt like moving through water, heavy and unrelenting. And yet, in the middle of this grief, Caleb began to change. At first, it seemed like the transformation was born from love. He rose earlier in the mornings, offering to make coffee before Harold left for the lumberyard. He stayed home more often, asking if I needed help with errands or chores. He took Andrew's place at the table, not sitting in his chair but filling the emptiness with his presence, always watching me carefully, as if measuring whether his words brought comfort. Neighbors praised him for being strong, for stepping up when life demanded too much of us. "Pat," they would say, "you're lucky to have such a devoted son." And I would smile politely because what else could I do? I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. Caleb spoke softly then, his voice stripped of its old sharpness. He offered to drive me to church on Sundays, folding his hands dutifully during the hymns. He asked Harold about his carpentry, standing by the workbench as though eager to learn, though I noticed his eyes rarely stayed on the wood. Still, the gesture mattered. It gave Harold something to focus on other than his own haunted silence. But beneath the surface of these gestures, I felt a tremor. There were moments when Caleb's mask slipped, when a shadow passed across his face as he thought no one was watching. He would stare at Andrew's old photographs for too long, not with grief, but with something harder, something almost resentful. He would tap his fingers restlessly on the wooden table during supper, his smile just a beat too late, his laugh pitched too carefully. One evening, I found him in the workshop alone. He stood over Harold's half-finished table, running his hand along the grain as though testing its strength. When he noticed me, he pulled his hand back quickly and said, "Dad's really good at this. I should probably learn." The words were gentle, but his eyes flickered, and for a second I thought I saw something brittle behind them. Harold, for his part, seemed conflicted. He allowed Caleb to hover, to help with small tasks, but I often caught him studying his son in the quiet way he once studied wood for flaws. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear Harold shifting restlessly in bed, sighing heavily into the dark. When I asked, he said only, "He's trying, Pat." Maybe this is how he's healing, and I wanted so desperately to believe that. There were glimpses of tenderness that almost convinced me. One Sunday afternoon, Caleb sat with me in the living room as I hemmed a curtain. He reached over and held my hand suddenly, surprising me. "I know how much you miss him," he said softly, "but you still have me." I remember the warmth of his hand, the way my heart ached at his words. It felt like a promise, though deep inside I wondered if it was also a plea. As the years passed, this new version of Caleb became the face he showed the world. To family friends, to our neighbors, to the congregation at church, he was the dutiful son who had sacrificed his youth to care for his grieving parents. They saw his visits, his phone calls, his careful way of walking me to the car. They did not see the moments of stillness when his smile didn't reach his eyes, or the way he deflected every mention of Andrew with a quick change of subject. I told myself that grief changes people, that perhaps this was his way of building a life after tragedy. But in the deepest parts of me, I felt something else. A chill that whispered this mask was not about healing. It was about covering something that would not bear the light. And yet I clung to the mask as much as he did, because it was easier to believe in a son who had grown into compassion than to acknowledge the nagging doubts that threatened to fracture me all over again. It was easier to sit at Harold's table, to eat supper in the glow of the lamplight and pretend we were still a family, fragile but intact. Every family photograph after Andrew's death told the same story. There was Harold, solemn and steady. There was me, smiling faintly, my eyes tired but open. And there was Caleb, standing just a little too straight, his arm draped around my shoulder as though claiming the place Andrew had once held. At first, I told myself it was love. Over time, I began to wonder if it was possession. There is a peculiar cruelty in grief. It doesn't just take what you love, it reshapes what remains. Caleb became both my comfort and my unease, my anchor and my shadow. I leaned on him because I had no choice, because the boy I had lost left a silence too vast to face alone. And in doing so, I ignored the cracks forming beneath the mask he wore so well. Looking back, I see now that every act of kindness carried the weight of calculation, every gesture carefully placed like wood in a frame he was building, not for me, not for Harold, but for himself. He was shaping a future where we would depend on him completely, where his mask would not just protect him, but serve as a doorway to something darker. In those years, I mistook that mask for healing. I mistook it for love. And by the time I realized what it truly was, the damage had already been done. Caleb was in his late 20s when he introduced us to Vanessa. It was during a Sunday dinner, the kind where Harold had roasted chicken, and I had set the table with Andrew's old favorite dishes, even though he wasn't there to eat them. Caleb walked in with her on his arm, and from the moment she stepped into our kitchen, I felt the temperature of the room shift. Vanessa was beautiful in the kind of way that made people look twice. Dark hair perfectly arranged, a smile that lingered just long enough to charm, eyes sharp enough to measure everyone in the room. She extended her hand to me, her grip firm, and said, "Mrs. Lawson, it's such a pleasure. Caleb's told me so much about you." Her voice was honey, smooth and practiced, and yet beneath the sweetness there was an edge I couldn't quite place. Harold greeted her politely, his carpenter's hands awkward as he shook hers. Ethan was not yet born, nor Clara. In those days, it was just Vanessa, gliding into our family circle as if she had always belonged, and Caleb, beaming with a pride I hadn't seen in years, sat close to her, his eyes darting between us as though gauging whether she had passed an invisible test. At first, I tried to be hopeful. I wanted to believe she might soften him, that her presence could ease the shadows that had clung to him since Andrew's death. She laughed at his jokes, praised his ambition, squeezed his hand whenever the conversation faltered. To the world, they were young, in love, and building a life together. But I noticed the way she observed everything, her gaze lingering on the details of our home. The photographs on the wall, the sturdy furniture Harold had crafted, the land visible from the kitchen window. She asked casual questions about the property, about the value of Harold's work, about the family's history. Questions that seemed innocent enough, but settled uneasily in my chest. When Caleb announced their engagement, I smiled and hugged them both, though something about the way Vanessa's eyes glittered over my shoulder made me shiver. She kissed my cheek and whispered, "You'll always be part of our family, Pat." Her words were kind, but they sounded like a contract, not a promise. Their wedding was simple, but elegant, a ceremony filled with laughter and congratulations. For a while, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps I had misjudged her. She hosted dinners, brought flowers, spoke sweetly to Harold and me, and yet in private moments, I would catch a flicker in her eyes when Caleb wasn't looking, a coldness that made me feel like she was less a daughter-in-law and more an accountant tallying the future. It was after their first year of marriage that the subject of the will came up. We were sitting at the dining table Harold had built, the one where Andrew once rested his elbows and Caleb once drummed his restless fingers. Caleb cleared his throat, his tone rehearsed. "Mom, Dad," he began, "Vanessa and I have been thinking about the future, about security, about what comes next. It might be time to update the will." The word hung in the air, heavy. I felt Harold stiffen beside me, his fork pausing mid-air. Caleb continued quickly, his smile practiced. "Of course, we're not saying anything needs to change now. It's just, life is unpredictable. We should make sure everything is in order." Vanessa reached across the table, her hand lightly brushing mine. "It's only practical, Pat. You've both worked so hard all your lives. You deserve peace of mind knowing things are settled." Her touch was warm, but her eyes were cool. I pulled my hand back slowly, forcing a smile. "We already have a will," I said softly. "Mr. Turner drafted it years ago." "Yes," Caleb replied smoothly, "but that was before Andrew. Before everything changed. It only makes sense to revise it to reflect where we are now." Harold set his fork down, his jaw tightening. "And where exactly do you think we are, son?" Caleb hesitated, but Vanessa did not. "You're older now," she said gently, as though speaking to children. "Things should be simpler. Streamlined. You don't want complications later." The conversation ended that night with polite nods, but the subject did not go away. Caleb brought it up again and again, sometimes in passing, sometimes with Vanessa leading the discussion. They insisted it was about responsibility, about avoiding burden, about love. But each time, I felt the walls of our home close in just a little tighter. Finally, Harold and I agreed to meet with Mr. Turner, the lawyer who had been with our family for decades. He was a man of gray hair and patient eyes, the kind who had known us long enough to remember when Andrew was still a boy. He welcomed us into his office, his shelves lined with books worn by use. "I understand you want to revise the will," he said kindly. Harold shifted uncomfortably. "It's not what we want exactly." "It's what Caleb keeps pressing for Mr. Turner," nodded, his pen tapping lightly against his notebook. "Families often revisit these things as circumstances change. The important part is that it reflects your wishes, not anyone else's." As he spoke, I caught the faintest flicker of relief in Harold's eyes. But Caleb leaned forward eagerly, Vanessa beside him, her posture straight and commanding. "We just want to be sure there's clarity," Caleb said. "No confusion later." Mr. Turner looked at him, then back at us. "And what do you want, Pat?" he asked gently. I swallowed hard. I wanted Andrew back. I wanted my family whole again. I wanted to stop feeling the sharp edge of suspicion slicing into every word, but all I said was, "I want peace." Vanessa smiled then, triumphant in a way that made my stomach churn. She squeezed Caleb's hand beneath the table, and though she spoke no words, the message was clear. This was only the beginning. That night, after they had left, Harold sat at the kitchen table in silence. His hand rested on the wood he had shaped decades earlier, his fingers tracing the grain as though it could anchor him. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes weary. "She's not here for family, Pat," he whispered. "She's here for everything else." I nodded because I had seen it too, and in that moment I understood that the mask Caleb had worn for so many years had found its perfect complement. Together, he and Vanessa formed a facade polished enough to fool anyone, but not me, not anymore. The first real fracture came with the house. It was a late autumn evening, the Wyoming sky already dimming to a bruised violet when Caleb and Vanessa arrived unannounced. I was in the kitchen, preparing stew, the smell of onions and thyme clinging to the air. Harold sat at the table, sanding the edge of a small wooden box he had been carving. When the door swung open, their voices filled the space, bright and deliberate, like a performance rehearsed many times. "Mom, Dad," Caleb began, shrugging off his jacket. "We've been talking. Vanessa and I have an idea that could really help all of us." I exchanged a glance with Harold, his brow furrowing as he set down his sandpaper. "What kind of idea?" he asked cautiously. Vanessa's smile stretched as she placed a folder on the table. The papers inside were neatly arranged, too neat for something casual. "The market's strong right now. If you sell this house, you could downsize, maybe even move closer to town. Think of how much easier life would be. No more long drives for groceries, no more maintenance for Harold." Her tone was soothing, but her eyes flicked across the room, lingering on the photographs of Andrew still lining the walls. I felt a coldness creep through me. This was not about convenience. "This house isn't just lumber," Harold said firmly. His voice had that gravelly edge I recognized from his workshop, the sound of a saw biting into wood. "It's where we raised our boys. It's where Andrew lived." Caleb leaned forward, his hands clasped together as though reasoning with stubborn children. "Dad, we know it means a lot. But sometimes sentiment holds people back. You and Mom could use the money for comfort, for travel, and Vanessa and I could finally have the space we need for Ethan and Clara." There it was, the truth slipping out from behind polished words. The house wasn't simply to be sold, it was to become theirs. I felt my chest tighten, as if the walls themselves were listening, bracing against being claimed. I tried to steady my voice. "This house is not a burden. It's our life. It's our memory of Andrew." For the briefest moment, Caleb's expression hardened, his jaw clenched, his voice dropping into something sharper. Memories don't pay bills, Mom. This place is worth more than what you're using it for. You should think about the future, not the past. The air stilled. Harold's hand gripped mine beneath the table, his palm rough, his fingers pressing a silent warning. Don't let him see fear. Vanessa reached over, her hand grazing Caleb's arm as if to reel him back into the performance. What Caleb means, she said smoothly, is that we love this house too. We want to make sure it stays in the family. You could still visit, of course. It would always be your home in spirit. Her words were silk, but the implication cut deep. Our home, reduced to a visit, to a guest room in a life no longer ours. I thought of the wooden table Harold had built, the one still scarred from years of meals and homework and laughter. I thought of Andrew sitting there, his head bent over textbooks, his steady voice reading aloud to his restless brother. To let this house go was to let go of the last place where we had all still been together. We're not selling, I said, sharper than I intended. My voice trembled, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of holding a line I knew I could not cross. Caleb's eyes darkened, and for the first time he didn't bother to hide the impatience simmering beneath his smile. You're being unreasonable. This is an opportunity, and you're just clinging to the past. Harold straightened in his chair, his tone steady and final. The answer is no, son. This house isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. The silence that followed was thick. Vanessa closed the folder with deliberate calm, her lips pressed into a thin line. Caleb leaned back, exhaling through his nose, like a man restraining himself from saying what he really thought. When they finally left, the stew on the stove had gone cold. Harold and I sat in silence, listening to the sound of their car pulling away, the gravel crunching under the tires like a warning. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something had shifted irrevocably. The mask Caleb had worn for years, dutiful, caring, attentive, had cracked. For the first time, I had heard the steel in his voice, seen the calculation in his eyes. He was no longer pretending only for us. He was starting to believe his own performance, convincing himself that what belonged to us should rightfully belong to him. I pressed my face into the pillow, staring at the shadowed ceiling, and whispered Andrew's name like a prayer. Because the son I had left was no longer the boy I remembered. He was a man with an agenda, and our house, the heart of our family, had become his target. The morning after Caleb and Vanessa tried to press us about the house, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. Harold had already gone out to the workshop, the rhythmic knock of his hammer echoing through the thin autumn air. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the phone on the wall, my fingers itching to reach for it. For years, I had carried my doubts silently, convincing myself that suspicion was disloyalty, that mothers were meant to forgive. But something about Caleb's voice the night before, sharp and cold, broke through the dam I had built inside me. I dialed Sophie's number before I could talk myself out of it. My sister answered on the third ring, her voice brisk but warm, as though she had been waiting for me. "Pat," she said, "I was just thinking of you." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat almost choking me. Sophie, I don't know what to do. Caleb, he wants us to sell the house. He and Vanessa keep pushing. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a long sigh. I've been waiting for this call. Her words startled me. What do you mean? Pat, I love you, but you've been blind when it comes to Caleb. Ever since Andrew died, you've looked at him like he's your only lifeline. But don't you remember what Andrew said before? Before that day? My hand tightened around the receiver. The memory of Andrew's smile, his calm eyes, came rushing back like a tide I had tried to hold at bay. What are you talking about? I whispered. Sophie's voice dropped low, steady. Andrew told me once, weeks before he died, that he was worried about Caleb. He said Caleb had gotten himself into trouble with money, that he was desperate. Andrew wanted to confront him, to make him stop before he did something reckless. Pat, he was afraid for Caleb, not himself. And then days later, Andrew was gone. The kitchen spun around me. I gripped the counter with my free hand, the old wood pressing into my palm. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I tried," she said gently, "but you wouldn't hear it. You were drowning in grief, and I didn't want to push you further under. I thought Harold might tell you one day. He always looked like he knew more than he let on." I turned to glance out the window, where Harold was bent over his bench, his shoulders hunched, his hands moving with methodical care. My heart sank. Was that what had haunted his silence all these years? "Sophie," I said, my voice shaking, "are you saying Caleb had something to do with Andrew's death?" She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched so long I thought the line had gone dead. Finally, she said, "I'm saying that Andrew didn't trust him, that he feared what Caleb was becoming, and if Andrew was right, then maybe you should start asking questions you've avoided for too long." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, my breath fogging it. I wanted to protest, to defend my son, to say that Caleb was flawed but not dangerous. Yet the image of his eyes at the dinner table, calculating, impatient, lingered in my mind. "What if I'm too late?" I whispered. "It's never too late to see the truth," Sophie said firmly, "but you need to be careful. Don't confront him outright. Watch, listen, and Pat, protect yourself. Protect Harold tears slipped down my cheeks silently. I hadn't cried in years, not since Andrew's funeral, but now they came hot and fast, as though Sophie's words had unlocked something I'd hidden even from myself. "I don't want to believe this," I said. "He's my son." "He's still your son," Sophie said softly, "but that doesn't mean he isn't capable of hurting you. You've always believed love could fix anything, but sometimes love blinds us. You need to open your eyes, Pat. Andrew tried to warn us. Don't let his voice go unheard again." We spoke a while longer, but her words hung over me long after the call ended. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the old family photo that still sat on the counter. Andrew's smile glowed in it, his arm draped protectively over a younger Caleb. At the time, I had thought it was a symbol of brotherly love. Now, I wondered if Andrew had been holding him back, keeping him from something darker. I walked outside to where Harold worked, the sun catching in his thinning hair. He looked up when I approached, his eyes narrowing at the sight of my tear-streaked face. "What is it?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. How could I tell him that Sophie had voiced aloud what I had always feared but never dared to speak? How could I place that weight on both of us without proof? So instead, I just shook my head. "Nothing," I murmured, "just tired." But inside, I was anything but tired. I was wide awake for the first time in years, the echo of Sophie's warning thrumming in my chest like a second heartbeat. Andrew's voice, long silenced, seemed to rise again in memory, urging me to see what I had refused to see. And from that day forward, I knew the mask Caleb wore was not just about grief or duty. It was about hiding, and I had to decide whether I would continue to protect him with my silence or finally face the truth my sister had laid bare. The days after Sophie's call were a blur of unease. Her words lingered in my mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. Andrew had feared for Caleb. Andrew had wanted to confront him. I couldn't stop replaying those sentences over and over. Every time I looked at Caleb now, I saw not just my son, but the shadow of something darker trailing behind him. And when I looked at Harold, I began to wonder if Sophie was right, that he had carried more than grief all these years. One evening, I found him in the workshop long after the sun had dipped behind the ridge. The lamp cast a dull glow across the room, throwing his face into half light and half shadow. He was sanding the edge of a table, but the rhythm was uneven, distracted. His shoulders sagged, his movements weary. "Harold," I said softly, stepping into the room, "you're still working?" He didn't look up, couldn't sleep. I closed the door behind me, the sound sharp in the quiet. Neither can I. For a long moment, the only sound was the scrape of sandpaper against wood. Then I took a deep breath. Sophie told me something. That made him pause. His hand stilled, though he didn't raise his eyes. "What did she tell you?" "She said Andrew came to her before he died. He told her he was worried about Caleb, that Caleb was in trouble." With money, my voice faltered, but I forced myself to keep going. "Harold, did you know about that?" Finally, he set the sandpaper down. His hands, those steady hands that had built our home piece by piece, trembled as they rested on the wood. He let out a long breath, like air leaking from a wound that had been sealed too long. "I wasn't going to tell you," he said quietly. My heart thudded against my ribs. "Tell me what?" He turned then, his eyes hollow, his jaw tight. "I saw them that day, Pat. At the canyon, Andrew and Caleb. They were arguing, not just bickering like brothers, angry, furious. Caleb was shouting, Andrew trying to calm him down. I stayed back, thinking they'd work it out, but it didn't stop. It got worse. My knees nearly gave out, and I gripped the edge of the workbench. "Why didn't you say something before?" "Because I didn't want to believe what I saw," he said, his voice cracking. "Because when Andrew fell, I thought, what if Caleb pushed him? What if my own son?" He trailed off, covering his face with his hands. But then Caleb told the sheriff it was an accident, and God help me, I let it go. I let him say it. I didn't speak. The workshop spun around me. For years, I had clung to the story of an accident because it was the only thing that kept me breathing. And now, to hear Harold admit he had seen them fighting, that he had buried that truth for 25 years, was like losing Andrew all over again. "You let me believe a lie," I whispered, my throat raw. "All these years." Harold dropped his hands, his eyes wet. "I thought I was protecting you. Protecting us. You were drowning, Pat. If I had told you then, it would have destroyed you. I thought, maybe if we stayed quiet, Caleb would change. Maybe guilt would soften him. But it didn't. It only made him colder. The sound of my own pulse filled my ears. And you carried this alone?" He nodded slowly. "Every day, every time I looked at him, I saw Andrew falling all over again. I hated myself for not shouting, for not telling the truth. But what good would it have done? Andrew was already gone, and Caleb was still our son." Tears blurred my vision. I turned away, staring at the wooden table he had been working on. Its surface was smooth, but underneath, hidden knots weakened the grain. Harold had taught Andrew to spot them, to carve around them so the wood would hold. But Harold had failed to do the same with our family. "Do you know what this means?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. "If Caleb could do that to his own brother, what do you think he's capable of now?" Harold's silence was answer enough. I sank into a chair, my hands shaking. All this time, I thought grief had made me paranoid. I thought the unease I felt around Caleb was just guilt. But Sophie was right. Andrew tried to warn us, and we didn't listen. Harold sat across from me, his shoulders heavy, his face lined with years of regret. "I failed him, Pat. I failed Andrew. And I failed you." The confession hung in the air, raw and unbearable. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old clock in the hallway, marking each second we could never take back. Finally, I reached across the table, placing my hand over Harold's. His skin was rough, calloused, familiar. "We can't change the past," I said softly, "but we can face the present. We can stop pretending Caleb is the son we wish he were. We can start seeing him for who he really is." Harold's eyes lifted to mine, searching. There was fear there, but also something steadier, a quiet resolve that I hadn't seen in years. "You're right," he said finally. "It's time." And in that moment, I knew our silence had ended. For the first time in 25 years, the truth had cracked open between us. Not the whole truth, perhaps, but enough to shatter the fragile mask we had built around Caleb, enough to change everything that came next. It was a gray afternoon when the phone rang, the kind of day where clouds sat low over the mountains, pressing down on the house with their weight. I was folding laundry in the living room, the old family photo of Andrew and Caleb staring back at me from the mantel, when the shrill ring startled me. I wiped my hands on a towel and lifted the receiver. "Mrs. Lawson?" a man's voice asked. "Yes, this is she." "This is Mr. Patel from First State Bank." "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I've been trying to reach Caleb and haven't been successful. Is he available?" Something in his tone made my stomach clench. "No, he doesn't live here." "What is this concerning?" There was a pause, the kind that tells you the person on the other end is debating whether to speak. "I probably shouldn't say much," he admitted. "But since you're his emergency contact, please remind him that his payment of $150,000 is severely past due. We've already extended grace twice. If we don't hear from him soon, there will be serious consequences." The number hit me like a physical blow. $150,000. My hand tightened on the receiver, knuckles pale. I see," I managed to whisper. "Thank you for letting me know." When I hung up, the silence of the room felt unbearable. I stared at the folded shirts in my lap, my mind reeling. Caleb had never mentioned anything about a loan, let alone one so large. And yet, suddenly, all the pieces began to slide into place. The urgency about the will, the insistence on selling the house, the sharpness in his voice when we refused. It wasn't about convenience. It wasn't even about inheritance. It was about survival. His survival. I carried the weight of the call to the workshop where Harold was planing a piece of wood. The smell of sawdust filled the air, grounding and familiar. For a moment, I watched him, his steady hands guiding the tool across the grain, as if creating something solid could erase the fractures in our family. "Harold," I said softly. He looked up, saw my face, and set the tool aside. "What is it?" I took a deep breath. "The bank called. About Caleb." His jaw tightened. "What did they say?" "He owes them $150,000. He's behind on his payments. They've tried to reach him, but he's not answering." Harold's eyes darkened, and he rubbed his hand across his forehead. "I knew it," he muttered. I knew something was off. The way he's been circling us, pushing about the house, pressing about the will, it wasn't about love, it was about money. I sank into the chair beside the workbench, my body trembling. Why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he just ask for help? Because asking would mean admitting weakness, Harold said bitterly, and Caleb's never been able to stand feeling less than Andrew. The mention of Andrew's name stung like a blade. I pictured my eldest son, the way he had steadied Caleb, the way he had tried to protect him, and I remembered Sophie's words. Andrew had wanted to confront him about money troubles. My throat tightened as the pieces clicked into place. Caleb's desperation wasn't new. It had been there 25 years ago, and Andrew had seen it. I pressed my palms to my face, trying to steady myself. Harold, what if Andrew's death wasn't just about anger? What if it was about this, about money? Harold was silent, but his eyes told me everything. He had thought the same thing. maybe for years. We can't ignore this anymore, I said firmly, lowering my hands. If Caleb is desperate enough to hide this from us, desperate enough to circle our house like a vulture, what else might he do? Harold leaned against the workbench, his hands gripping the edge. I thought I could carry this secret alone. I thought by keeping quiet about what I saw that day at the canyon, I was protecting you. But I see now, silence only made him bolder. My heart pounded. So what do we do? For a moment, Harold didn't answer. He looked at the wood shavings on the floor, at the table half-built behind him, at the life he had crafted with his hands. Then he met my eyes, and there was no hesitation in his voice. We prepare, Pat. We stop pretending Caleb is the boy we raised, and we make sure whatever he's planning next, we're not caught off guard. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake beside Harold, the words of Mr. Patel circling in my head. $150,000. Debt so heavy it could drown a man. I thought of Caleb's calm eyes at Andrew's funeral, the way he had never looked back at the canyon. I thought of Vanessa's smile, sharp and unyielding, and I realized that our son's troubles were no longer just his own. They were about to swallow us whole. I rose quietly and walked into the living room, where the moonlight cast long shadows across the photographs on the wall. Andrew's face stared back at me, forever young, forever kind. I whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry, my boy." I should have seen sooner. I should have asked harder questions. The house creaked in the wind, the walls holding secrets I had been too afraid to face. But now, with the bank's call still ringing in my ears, I knew the truth could no longer be buried. Caleb's debt was not just financial. It was moral, spiritual, a weight that had begun long before Andrew fell. And if we didn't act, that weight would drag us down with him. The phone rang just after supper, when Harold and I were clearing the table. The night was calm, the kind of evening where routine usually brought comfort. The scrape of plates, the hum of the dishwasher, the faint smell of pine drifting in through the open window. But when I lifted the receiver and heard Caleb's voice, smooth and cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed, unease crept over me. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking. You and Dad have your 42nd wedding anniversary coming up. Vanessa and I want to do something special. We thought we'd take you both out to the Canyon Trail this weekend. Make it a celebration. Pictures, a picnic, the works I froze, the word canyon slicing through me like a shard of glass." My hand tightened around the phone cord. "The canyon?" I repeated softly, my eyes flicking to Harold, who had stopped mid-motion, a dish still in his hand. "Yes," Caleb continued, his tone light, almost too light. "It's beautiful this time of year. The leaves are changing, the air's crisp. Perfect for a family outing. And besides, you two deserve it. You've sacrificed so much for us. Let us treat you." On the surface, it sounded generous, thoughtful even. But underneath, I heard something else. The insistence, the control in the way he framed it as a gift we couldn't refuse. "Caleb," I said carefully, "your father and I aren't much for big outings anymore. You know that." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "Mom, don't be stubborn. It's just a few hours. We'll handle everything. Vanessa's already packing baskets. Think of it as a way to make new memories." New memories. The word sent a chill through me. My old memories of the canyon were haunted enough. The place where Andrew had died, the place where Harold's silence had begun. To return there now, under Caleb's insistence, felt like walking into a storm I had seen forming on the horizon for years. "I'll talk with your father," I murmured, trying to buy time. "Good," Caleb replied briskly. "We'll pick you up at noon Saturday." Don't worry about a thing. When I hung up, the silence between Harold and me was deafening. He set the dish down slowly, his jaw clenched tight. "The canyon," he muttered. "Of all places." I sat down heavily, my hands trembling. "Harold, it's not just a celebration. He wants something from us. Maybe the house, maybe the will, or maybe—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Harold's eyes met mine, dark and unflinching. "I don't think this is about asking anymore. I think it's about forcing a cold weight settled in my stomach. What do we do?" He was silent for a long moment, then he walked to the drawer near his workbench and pulled out a small black recorder. He set it on the table between us. "I bought this a week ago. Thought it might come to this. If Caleb says anything that proves what he's planning, we'll have it. No more silence, Pat. No more burying the truth." I stared at the recorder, the gravity of it sinking in. It felt strange, preparing to protect ourselves from our own son. But after the bank's call, after Sophie's warning, after Harold's confession, I knew we had no other choice. That night, I wrote a letter to Sophie. I didn't explain everything, just enough so she would know if something happened, where to look, who to question. My handwriting trembled on the page, but the act of writing steadied me. I folded it carefully and tucked it inside an envelope, leaving it in my nightstand drawer. In bed, Harold lay awake beside me, his breathing uneven. "I'll carry the recorder," he whispered. "Don't react, no matter what Caleb says. Just stay calm. Let him reveal himself." I nodded, though fear pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. "What if it's too late, Harold?" He turned toward me, his face etched with lines deeper than the years alone could explain. "It's only too late if we stay silent again." Sleep didn't come easily. When I did drift off, I dreamed of Andrew standing at the canyon edge, his face calm but his voice urgent. "Don't let him take more from you, Mom," he said. "Don't let silence be the weapon again." I woke before dawn, the dream still echoing in my ears. As the first light filtered through the curtains, I looked over at Harold. He was already awake, his hand resting on the recorder. Our eyes met and no words were needed. We both knew Saturday would not be a celebration. It would be a reckoning. The days leading up to Saturday stretched long and heavy, like hours stitched together with thread too thin to hold. I moved through them quietly, doing the small tasks of life, folding laundry, watering plants, preparing meals. But every motion carried a weight I couldn't set down. The letter I had written to Sophie remained hidden in my nightstand, its presence like a heartbeat in the dark. I touched it each night, reminding myself that if something happened, at least one person outside this house would know where the trail began. Harold carried the recorder with him constantly, almost obsessively. He would slip it in and out of his pocket, checking the battery, testing the small red light. I watched him polish the wood of the box he'd been carving for weeks, his hands steady but his eyes clouded. Once I asked him what he was thinking, and he only said, "I'm thinking about what silence cost us before." I didn't press him. I knew the answer because I was thinking the same. Inside me, two voices warred. One told me to keep the peace, to nod and smile, to accept Caleb's invitation with grace. Families survive by forgiveness, I reminded myself, by looking past flaws and clinging to love. But the other voice, the one I had buried for decades, rose louder each day. It whispered that forgiveness without truth is not love at all, but surrender. I found myself staring at Andrew's photograph more often, the one where he sat on the porch steps with a book in his lap, sunlight catching in his hair. His smile was calm, gentle, untroubled. I would whisper to the glass, "What would you want me to do? Would you want me to fight? Or would you want me to keep this family from tearing apart completely?" And though the photograph offered no reply, in the silence I felt his absence pressing an answer on me. He had tried to warn us. He had spoken, and we hadn't listened. To remain quiet now would be to betray him twice. One evening, as I set supper on the table, Caleb's name lit up my phone. I let it ring until the machine picked up, his voice cheerful and insistent as he reminded us of the celebration. When the message ended, Harold looked at me across the table. "Do you want to back out?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "If we back out, he'll find another way. At least this way we'll be ready." He nodded, though unease shadowed his eyes. We ate in near silence, the scrape of forks loud against the plates. Each bite tasted of dread. That night, long after Harold had drifted into a shallow sleep, I sat at the desk in our bedroom, staring at a blank sheet of paper. My hands shook as I began another letter, this one to Ethan and Clara. I didn't know if they would ever read it, but I needed to leave something for them, something to remind them that their grandparents had loved them without condition. I wrote about summers in the yard, about Harold teaching Andrew to build birdhouses, about the sweetness of cornbread cooling on the windowsill. I wrote that love was not meant to be sharp or manipulative, that they deserved better than the examples set before them. When I folded the letter, tears blurred my vision. I tucked it beside the first one, and in that act I felt a strange calm. I had prepared for the worst. I had broken the silence that had bound me for so long, if only on paper. The next morning, Sophie called. Her voice was brisk as always, but beneath it I heard concern. "Pat, I keep thinking about what we talked about. Please, if you feel unsafe, cancel. Don't go." I closed my eyes, gripping the receiver. "Sophie, if I cancel, Caleb will only push harder. He's circling us. This isn't about one afternoon, it's about everything. I need to see this through." She sighed heavily. "Then promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," I whispered, though the words felt fragile. After we hung up, I found Harold in the yard, fixing the latch on the gate. His movements were deliberate, his face set. I walked to him and placed my hand on his arm. "We're not going to be silent anymore," I said. He turned, his eyes meeting mine. "No," he agreed. "We're not." That night, lying in bed, I listened to the wind rattle the windows. Every creak of the house sounded like a warning. My body trembled, not only with fear, but with anticipation. For so long, silence had been my shield. But silence had cost me Andrew, had cost me peace, had left me living beside shadows instead of truth. Now I was stepping into the unknown, into danger, but with eyes open. As sleep finally pulled me under, I clung to Harold's steady breath beside me and the letters waiting in my drawer. If Saturday ended with loss, at least the truth would not be buried with us. Saturday arrived draped in a silence that felt heavier than any storm. I woke before dawn, sitting at the edge of the bed with my slippers on, staring at the floorboards as if they might tell me how the day would end. Harold was already awake. He sat in his chair by the window, fully dressed, his hands folded in his lap. The recorder was in his pocket, and though he said nothing, I could see in the way his jaw tightened that he was rehearsing the weight of carrying it. I moved through the motions of the morning with the deliberate care of someone who knew this could be their last. I brewed coffee, buttered toast neither of us ate, folded the dish towel over the oven handle just as I always did. The normalcy of it made my chest ache. Every small gesture whispered goodbye. At noon sharp, the crunch of tires on gravel announced Caleb and Vanessa's arrival. Their SUV gleamed in the sun, its back loaded with picnic baskets and folded blankets. Vanessa stepped out first, her smile practiced, her eyes scanning me with the precision of someone evaluating a chessboard. Caleb followed, waving broadly. "Happy anniversary," he declared, his voice too bright. "We've got everything set up." "It's going to be a beautiful day," Harold and I exchanged a look. I forced a smile, tucking my hand into Harold's arm. "Thank you," I said. "It's very thoughtful." The ride to the canyon was filled with false cheer. Vanessa talked about the children, Ethan's grades, Clara's drawings, sprinkling in details as though we were simply another family on another pleasant drive. Caleb asked Harold about the workshop, about whether he'd finished the table he'd been carving. On the surface, it was ordinary conversation. But underneath, I felt the silence, the unspoken tension threading through every word. I kept my eyes fixed on the passing landscape. The fields blurred into forests, the forests into rocky slopes. Each turn of the road pulled us farther from safety, deeper into memory. When the first glimpse of the canyon appeared on the horizon, my breath caught. The ridges rose jagged against the pale sky, their shadows cutting across the valley like scars. Harold's hand brushed mine discreetly, a reminder. I pressed back, grounding myself in his touch. When we parked at the trailhead, the air was cool and sharp, tinged with pine and the faint mineral smell of stone. Vanessa spread a blanket, unpacking sandwiches and bottles of sparkling water, her movement smooth and deliberate. Caleb insisted on taking photographs, lining us up against the backdrop of the cliffs. "Smile, Mom," he said, lifting the camera. "This is going to be one for the books." I tried, though my lips trembled. Behind me, the canyon yawned wide and endless. I felt the same chill I had felt the day Andrew died, the same sense of standing at the edge of something too vast to comprehend. As we ate, Caleb's charm never faltered. He poured drinks, offered seconds, laughed at Vanessa's stories. But I noticed the way he kept glancing toward the cliff, the way his eyes lingered on Harold and me, as though calculating distance, timing. Vanessa, too, played her role with perfection. She spoke gently, praising the view, brushing crumbs from Caleb's sleeve. Yet when our eyes met, her smile froze. And in that stillness, I saw the truth. This was not celebration. This was preparation. I nibbled at my sandwich, my stomach tight with dread. Harold sipped his drink, his face unreadable, but I knew his every sense was sharpened. The recorder in his pocket was switched on, its silent red light bearing witness. After lunch, Caleb clapped his hands together. "All right, let's stretch our legs." "The overlook is just a short walk." "You'll love it, Mom. The best view in the whole state." I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Caleb, maybe we should stay here. The rocks can be tricky." He laughed, sliding an arm around my shoulder, guiding me forward. "Don't worry. I've got you." The path narrowed as we walked, the ground crunching beneath our feet. To my right, the canyon opened, vast and merciless. The air grew thinner, the wind sharper, tugging at my sweater. Harold walked close behind, his steps steady but heavy. Vanessa trailed, humming softly, her eyes always on us. Every footstep felt like a countdown. I thought of Andrew, of his last moments, of the fight Harold had seen. I thought of Sophie's warning, of the letters I had written. I thought of Ethan and Clara, who had no idea what kind of storm their parents were carrying them into. At last, we reached the overlook. Caleb turned, his smile wide, his arms spreading as though unveiling a stage. "See? Isn't it worth it?" The canyon stretched before us, a scar carved deep into the earth. My breath caught at its vastness, at the way the light caught the rocks in shades of gold and red. Beautiful. Terrible. A place where lives could vanish with a single misstep. Harold moved closer, his hand brushing mine again. His voice was steady but low, just for me. "Stay calm. Let it play out." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. And so we stood there, framed by beauty and danger, by memory and dread. Caleb raised the camera once more, his eyes glinting as he said, "Let's get closer to the edge." The picture will be perfect. The sun had begun to slip westward, spilling long shadows across the canyon, when Caleb beckoned us closer to the overlook. His camera dangled from his neck, swaying gently with each step. Vanessa walked just behind him, her eyes sharp and unyielding, despite the faint smile fixed on her lips. "Come on, Mom, Dad," Caleb urged, waving us forward. "Stand right there, closer to the edge." The shot will be incredible. The edge. The word tightened around my chest like a rope. The wind picked up, carrying the dry scent of dust and pine, rustling through my hair. Beneath us, the canyon yawned wide and merciless, its silence deeper than any church I'd ever stepped into. I hesitated, glancing at Harold. His jaw was clenched, his eyes locked on Caleb, but he gave the faintest nod. A silent message. Go along, but stay alert. We shuffled forward. The ground beneath my shoes felt brittle, pebbles scattering with each step. I thought of Andrew. His fall, the questions left unanswered, the weight of silence Harold had carried for 25 years. I thought of Sophie's warning, of the letters tucked away in my drawer. Every step toward that edge felt like walking straight into destiny. Perfect, Caleb said, positioning us. A little closer, Mom. Dad, put your arm around her, Vanessa. Get ready. His voice was cheerful, but the cheer rang hollow. I could hear the strain beneath it, the urgency of a man cornered. His debts, his failures, the cracks in his carefully built mask, they were all pressing him forward, pushing him toward this moment. I stood stiffly, my back to the canyon. The wind tugged harder now, my skirt whipping against my legs. Caleb adjusted the camera, then stepped forward, his hands reaching not for the lens, but for Harold's shoulder. And that was when Harold leaned in close, his voice a low murmur against my ear. Stay still. Not yet. The words sent a shiver down my spine. They were more than a warning. They were a command, a plea for patience in the face of terror. Caleb's hand pressed harder against Harold's back. I felt the shift of weight, the subtle forward push. Harold staggered a step closer to the edge, and I instinctively tightened my grip on his arm. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat echoing in the hollow below. Smile, Caleb said, his tone sharper now. This is a celebration, remember? Vanessa laughed softly, though there was no joy in it. Hold still, Pat. You'll ruin the picture if you keep shaking. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw no warmth, no family, only calculation. The kind of cold determination that had nothing to do with photographs or anniversaries. I felt the ground shift beneath my heels, a tiny crumble of dirt sliding away into the abyss. My breath caught. I was one step from vanishing, one heartbeat from joining Andrew in the canyon below. Caleb's hand lingered on Harold's shoulder, steady, insistent. Caleb, I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the wind. Please. For a fleeting moment, his expression cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickered. I saw the boy he once was, the child who had carved small wooden figures and left them on my desk without a word. But then it was gone, replaced by the man driven by debt, envy, and desperation. Closer, he ordered. Just one more step. Harold's grip on my hand tightened painfully, anchoring me. His voice, rough and steady, whispered again. Not yet. The tension in the air was unbearable, stretched to its breaking point. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Caleb's hand pressed forward and I braced myself, every muscle rigid. For a moment, time fractured. The canyon below spinning, Andrew's face flashing in my memory, Sophie's warning ringing in my head. Then, just as suddenly, Caleb released his hand, stepping back with a broad grin. Perfect, he said as if nothing had happened. That's the shot. Harold exhaled slowly, his shoulders trembling beneath my hand. I forced a smile for the camera, though my lips felt carved from stone. Vanessa clicked the shutter, her eyes glinting with something that told me she knew exactly what had just transpired. We stepped back from the edge, my knees weak, my breath shallow. Caleb slung an arm around my shoulders, his laughter ringing hollow in the open air. See? I told you it would be worth it. But I knew what had almost happened. What would have happened if Harold hadn't anchored us, if his whisper hadn't held me steady. The canyon had nearly claimed us, just as it had claimed Andrew. And in Caleb's forced smile, in Vanessa's satisfied silence, I saw the truth clearer than ever. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The path back from the overlook was narrow, the ground uneven beneath our feet. The sun had dropped lower, staining the canyon walls in shades of rust and gold, but to me the light felt harsh, exposing every shadow inside my son's face. Caleb walked just ahead, his camera swinging at his chest, his stride brisk. Vanessa followed closely, the picnic basket now empty, her eyes never leaving Harold and me, as though she feared we might slip from her grasp. My heart hadn't slowed since the moment at the edge. Harold's whisper still pulsed in my ear, a steady refrain. Stay still. Not yet. I clung to it like a lifeline, even as fear gnawed at me. The trail curved sharply, the cliff yawning once more to our right. Caleb stopped suddenly, turning toward us with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Why don't we get just one more picture?" "The light is perfect here." Harold stiffened beside me, his fingers brushing mine, the recorder in his pocket pressing against my awareness. "We already took plenty," he said evenly, but Caleb's grin widened. "Come on, Dad." "Just one more." For old time's sake, Vanessa's hand slipped into Caleb's, her touch light but commanding. "Do it," she murmured, too quiet for anyone but us to hear. I felt the air thicken, the canyon pulling at us like a silent accomplice. My knees trembled as Caleb gestured for us to step forward again. Harold obeyed, his movements measured, guiding me with him. I wanted to scream, to run, but Andrew's memory pressed on me, reminding me that silence, patience, and timing were sometimes the only weapons left. We stood near the edge again, the rocks loose beneath our shoes. Caleb lifted his camera but didn't raise it to his eye. Instead, he set it against his chest, both hands free now, his body coiled like a spring. And then it happened, so fast and yet slow enough that I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. Caleb lunged forward, his shoulder striking Harold, his hands shoving hard. Vanessa gasped, not in surprise but in anticipation. The ground gave way beneath us, and for a heartbeat, the world tilted. I felt Harold's arm wrap around me, pulling me tight against him as we tumbled. The wind tore at my hair, the roar of the canyon rushing to meet us, and then impact. Not the fatal drop I had braced for, but a crashing slide down a ledge hidden just below. The rocks bruised my body, tore at my palms, but we were alive. I lay still, gasping, my heart thrashing in my chest. Above us, I heard Caleb's breathless laugh, the sound brittle and wild. "It's done," he muttered. Vanessa's voice followed, sharp with relief. "Finally." Harold's hand gripped mine tightly, his lips close to my ear. "Don't move. Don't let them know," so we lay there, motionless as though broken. My cheek pressed against the cold stone, my eyes half closed. From where I was, I could hear every word carried by the canyon's echo. "They'll call it an accident," Vanessa whispered. "Two old people too close to the edge. No one will question it." Caleb exhaled heavily. "The house will be ours." The will, too. No more debts hanging over my head. A wave of nausea rose inside me, but I forced my body to remain still. Harold's grip on my hand tightened every time my breath threatened to quicken, grounding me, reminding me that this was our moment to gather the truth we had been denied for so long. The canyon wind carried Caleb's next words clearly. "Andrew almost ruined everything back then. He was going to tell. I couldn't let him. And now—" His voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of confession. My eyes burned, tears threatening to spill, but I swallowed them back. Andrew's ghost had been whispering to me for years, but now his truth was laid bare in daylight. Our son had killed his brother, and today he had tried to kill us, too. Vanessa's voice cut through my thoughts. We should go. The longer we stay, the greater the chance someone sees us. Caleb muttered something, then their footsteps receded along the trail. Each crunch of gravel grew softer until silence reclaimed the canyon. Only then did Harold shift, wincing in pain. "We're alive," he whispered hoarsely. I turned to him, my body aching but intact. "You heard him," I breathed. "You heard what he said." He nodded grimly, and the recorder heard it too. For a moment, relief and grief tangled inside me. We had proof, but it came with the confirmation of what we had feared all along, that our own son had destroyed the family from within. Slowly, Harold helped me sit up, both of us battered but unbroken. The canyon stretched below us, vast and merciless, but in its echo we carried something stronger than fear. We carried truth. The ambulance ride blurred into fragments, flashing lights reflected on canyon walls, the jolt of wheels over uneven road, the faint antiseptic smell that clung to the paramedics' gloves. Harold and I had been found by hikers who had called for help, and though neither of us was gravely injured, our bodies bore the marks of the fall. Bruises blossomed across my ribs, a gash ran along Harold's forearm, and every movement reminded me of how close we had come to the abyss. At the hospital, the corridors buzzed with muted urgency. The walls were a pale shade of green, meant to calm, though nothing could calm the storm inside me. I lay in a narrow bed, monitors softly beeping, while Harold was wheeled into the room beside mine. We exchanged a glance, a silent vow, not a word about the recorder, not yet. Caleb and Vanessa arrived within the hour. They swept into the ward with an air of concern, so polished it could have fooled anyone. Caleb's voice was loud enough for the nurses to hear. "Mom! Dad!" We were so worried. What happened out there? His tone was syrup, but his eyes flicked over me with a sharpness that betrayed him. He wanted to know what we remembered, what we might say. Vanessa hovered near the foot of my bed, her hand pressed to her chest in feigned alarm. "It was an accident," Harold muttered, his voice deliberately even. The rocks gave way. I forced myself to nod, though bile rose in my throat at the lie. "Yes," I whispered. "We're lucky we didn't fall farther." Relief passed over Caleb's face, not the relief of a son spared from losing his parents, but of a man who believed his secret was still intact. He exhaled loudly and sank into a chair. "I don't know what we'd do without you both," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. The nurse who had been tending to Harold lingered in the doorway. She was young, with kind eyes and an attentive manner. Her name tag read Felicity Inns. She adjusted Harold's IV and smiled faintly. "You're both fortunate," she said softly. "That trail is dangerous." Caleb turned to her, perhaps forgetting that words spoken in hospitals have a way of carrying farther than one intends. "Fortunate," he said, his laugh hollow. "You don't know the half of it. If Andrew had just kept his mouth shut back then, none of this would have been necessary." The words slipped out like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples that froze the air. My breath caught, my fingers curling into the sheet. Harold's eyes widened, locking on mine. Nurse Felicity stiffened slightly, her expression flickering before she regained her composure. She adjusted the monitor with deliberate calm, though her ears had clearly caught every syllable. "What did you say?" she asked lightly, her tone almost playful, as if inviting him to repeat himself. Caleb's face flushed. He forced a chuckle. "Nothing. Just rambling. Stress, you know?" He waved his hand dismissively, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Vanessa stepped forward quickly, her voice smooth, redirecting the moment. "My husband has been under immense pressure. Please don't take his words seriously." But the damage was already done. Felicity's eyes lingered on Caleb, sharp with awareness. She gave me the faintest glance before leaving the room, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. Caleb stood abruptly. "We should let you rest," he said. "We'll come back tomorrow." Vanessa leaned in, her lips brushing my cheek, her whisper cold against my skin. "Get well soon, Pat." When they were gone, the silence in the room felt heavy, but beneath it ran a current of something new. Hope. Harold turned his head toward me, his voice low. She heard him. I nodded, tears brimming. And she knows what it means. We didn't speak further. The nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting machines, but my mind was fixed on Felicity. Would she speak up? Would she remember every word Caleb had said? For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of truth shifting, tilting toward us. That night, as Harold slept fitfully, I stared at the ceiling tiles above my bed, tracing their pattern like a map leading somewhere better. My body ached, but my heart was alive with a clarity I hadn't felt since Andrew's death. Caleb's mask had cracked, not in the privacy of our home, not in whispers I could never prove, but here, in a place where others could hear. When the nurse returned at dawn, she paused at my bedside. Her eyes met mine, steady and knowing. She didn't speak of what she had overheard, but she didn't need to. Her presence was enough. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a long, deep breath. The silence that had smothered us for so long was breaking, not with shouts or confrontations, but with slips of truth carried on the careless tongue of the son who thought he had won. I was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, though the bruises still mottled my arms and ribs. Harold moved slower than usual, but his eyes held a steadiness that had been absent for years. We returned home to the familiar creak of the porch steps and the quiet hum of the house that had seen too much. I thought perhaps we would have a few days of silence before Caleb returned with new demands. But the very next morning, a knock at the door startled me from my coffee. When I opened it, there stood our neighbor, Mr. Hargrove. His tall frame filled the doorway, his weathered face drawn serious. He held a folder under his arm, and his eyes flicked past me to Harold before he spoke. "May I come in?" I led him to the kitchen table, the one Harold had built years ago, now scarred with use but still solid. Mr. Hargrove set the folder down with care, his voice low. "I don't mean to intrude, but I've noticed things. And after what happened at the canyon, I can't stay silent." Harold and I exchanged a look. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. He opened the folder, spreading out papers that smelled faintly of ink and dust. "I work part-time at the courthouse now, filing records. I came across these last month. Loan documents, signatures, Caleb's, and yours." He slid the papers across the table toward us. I frowned, scanning the page. My name stared back at me, written in my familiar script, except it wasn't. The loops were off, the pressure uneven, a forgery. "That's not my signature," I said, my voice tightening. Harold picked up another sheet, his jaw tightening. "And that's not mine." Mr. Hargrove nodded grimly. "I thought so. He forged your names to secure loans. Multiple times. The amounts are staggering. The bank's been patient, but not for much longer. If this comes to light officially, it's not just debt, it's fraud." My stomach turned. Caleb hadn't just been circling us with words. He had been stealing from us in ink, binding us to his desperation without our consent. "There's more," Mr. Hargrove continued. He pulled out a stack of overdue notices, each one harsher than the last. "He's drowning, Pat. The walls are closing in. I've seen men ruin themselves in debt before. But Caleb, he's not just dragging himself down. He's dragging you with him." I pressed a hand to my chest, the weight of it nearly crushing. For years, I had wondered what secrets Caleb carried. Now the proof lay on our table, undeniable, each page a testimony of betrayal. Harold leaned back, his face etched with sorrow and resolve. So he's been lying to us for years, pretending to care while forging our names, using us as his safety net. Mr. Hargrove's eyes softened, though his voice remained firm. "I don't want to interfere in your family, but you deserve to know, and if the law comes calling, you'll need to be prepared." I folded my hands tightly, feeling the tremor in my bones. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. You did the right thing." He gave a small nod, gathered the rest of his folder, and rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "Pat, Harold, don't wait too long. Men like Caleb. When they feel cornered, they become dangerous." After he left, Harold and I sat in silence, staring at the papers spread before us. The morning light filtered through the curtains, falling across Andrew's photograph on the mantel. His eyes seemed to follow us, urging us to act. I reached across the table, my hand covering Harold's. "We have what we need now. His words at the canyon, his slip at the hospital, and this. For once, the truth isn't locked inside of us, it's written down." Harold nodded, his jaw set. "Then we'll take it to the right hands. No more protecting him. No more silence." The recorder in his pocket, the papers on our table, the memory of Felicity's knowing glance, all of it formed a net of truth too strong for Caleb to escape. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight on my chest ease, replaced not with peace but with purpose. Our son had built his mask carefully, but the cracks had spread too far, and now, with Mr. Hargrove's evidence, the mask would shatter. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, its high ceilings echoing with the low hum of voices and the shuffle of papers. I sat on the hard wooden bench beside Harold, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. Sunlight streamed in through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that floated like suspended memories. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like to stand in this place with Caleb, but never had I pictured it like this. Our son sitting at the defense table, his head bowed but his shoulders tense. Vanessa beside him with her chin raised defiantly. The judge, a stern man with kind but tired eyes, entered, and the room quieted. "Court is now in session," he announced. His gavel struck, and the sound reverberated through me. It was the sound of finality, of the silence ending. Detective Owens presented the case first. His voice was steady, laying out the timeline. The forged documents uncovered by Mr. Hargrove, the debt notices, the bank's attempts to collect. He spoke of the incident at the canyon, how Harold and I had survived a fall that might have ended differently. And then he played the recording Harold had carried in his pocket, Caleb's voice echoing through the room. If Andrew had just kept his mouth shut back then, none of this would have been necessary. The words hung heavy, undeniable. I heard a gasp from someone in the gallery. Caleb shifted in his chair, his face blanching. Vanessa's eyes flickered, but her expression quickly hardened again. Then Nurse Felicity took the stand. Calm and precise, she testified about what she'd overheard in the hospital. Her words were measured, her presence steady. He spoke of Andrew as if his death had not been an accident. I knew what I heard. I knew it was important. The room seemed to shrink around me as the prosecutor asked if anyone else wished to testify. I rose slowly, my knees weak but my resolve firm. Harold's hand brushed mine briefly before I stepped forward. On the stand, I felt the weight of every eye upon me. I looked at Caleb, my son, my flesh and blood, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to leave little wooden carvings on my desk. But then I saw Andrew's face in my memory, his quiet strength, his untimely end. "My name is Patricia Lawson," I began. My voice shook at first, but I steadied it. "I am Andrew Lawson's mother, and I am also Caleb Lawson's mother. I stand here with both truths in my heart I told the court about Andrew, his kindness, his dreams, the way he had tried to protect his brother. I spoke of the day he died, how Caleb returned home too calm, too rehearsed. I recounted the years of silence, the mask Caleb had worn, the pressure he and Vanessa had placed on us to change the will, to sell the house. And then, I said, my eyes locking on Caleb's, he led us to the edge of the canyon. He smiled. He told us to step closer. My husband whispered for us to stay still. Not yet. And when the ground crumbled, when we fell, I realized something I had denied for too long. My son was no longer my son. He had become the hand that pushed us closer to death. The courtroom was silent. Caleb's head snapped up, his face pale but defiant. His voice cracked as he spoke for the first time. "Mom, stop. Please, I'm still your son?" The words pierced me, sharper than any blade. My eyes blurred with tears, but I forced myself to speak the truth that had weighed on me for 25 years. "My son died the night you killed Andrew." Gasps rippled through the room. Caleb flinched as if struck, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. Vanessa turned her face away, her mask of control faltering. I swallowed hard, my chest heaving. The boy I raised, the one who carved toys, who laughed with his brother, that boy is gone. The man sitting before me is a stranger, and I will not protect him with my silence anymore. When I stepped down from the stand, Harold rose in my place. His testimony was brief but unflinching. He admitted what he had seen that day at the canyon with Andrew and Caleb. The fight, the rage, the silence he had carried all these years. His voice cracked with regret, but it carried the weight of truth. By the time both sides had finished, the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the recorded confession, the witness testimony, it was all there, laid bare. The mask Caleb had built for so long had shattered piece by piece. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was steady, final. This court finds Caleb Lawson guilty of fraud and of attempted harm. Further investigation into the death of Andrew Lawson will proceed with full weight of the law. His gavel struck once more, and with it decades of silence ended. As bailiffs moved to escort Caleb and Vanessa away, he turned to me one last time, his eyes wild with desperation. "Mom," he pleaded, "I can change. Please, don't let them take me." But I did not move. My hands gripped the edge of the bench, my body trembling but my heart steady. "You made your choice long ago, Caleb?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure if he heard. When the doors closed behind him, I exhaled a breath I had been holding for 25 years. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but they were not the tears of silence. They were the tears of truth finally spoken. Harold reached for my hand, his fingers warm and rough. We sat together in the quiet hum of the courtroom, surrounded by strangers yet not alone. For the first time since Andrew's death, justice had stepped into the room, and I knew we had done what needed to be done. The weeks after the trial passed like a slow unfurling, the tension that had gripped our home loosening thread by thread. The house felt different now, not lighter exactly, but honest. The silence that had once suffocated us had shifted into a quiet where healing could begin. Ethan and Clara came to stay with us soon after. They arrived with small suitcases, their eyes wide and uncertain, as though they weren't sure if they were guests or something more. Ethan, at 12, tried to act older than he was, carrying his sister's bag and standing protectively beside her. Clara, only 9, clutched a stuffed rabbit, her cheeks pink with the effort of holding back tears. I knelt to their level, opening my arms. For a moment they hesitated, but then they both came to me, pressing their small bodies into my chest. I held them tightly, feeling their trembling slow against me. Harold stood behind us, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his voice rough but gentle. "You're safe here. You'll always be safe here." Our days together became a rhythm. I packed lunches for school, braided Clara's hair, helped Ethan with his math homework at the kitchen table Harold had built long ago. In the evenings, Harold taught Ethan how to sand wood, showing him how to follow the grain while Clara sat beside me, sketching birds and flowers in her notebook. The house, once echoing with absence, began to fill with the sounds of children again. Laughter, footsteps, the quiet hum of ordinary life. Still, at night when the house was still, I found myself drawn to Andrew's photograph on the mantel. I would sit in the rocking chair, a notebook on my lap, and write. At first the words came haltingly, but soon they flowed, as though Andrew himself were listening on the other side of the page. "Dear Andrew, I wrote one night. It has taken me 25 years to speak the truth out loud. I thought silence would protect us, but it only buried you deeper. I am sorry for every day I chose quiet instead of justice. But know this, your voice was never truly gone. It lived in me, in your father, in Sophie, waiting for the moment we would no longer be afraid. The ink blurred as tears fell onto the page. I wiped them away and continued, "Your brother is lost to us. I wish it were different, but I cannot change what he became. I can only protect what you loved most. Ethan and Clara are with us now. I see pieces of you in them. Ethan's stubborn kindness, Clara's gentle heart. I promise you they will know love that is steady and real, not twisted by fear or greed. They will grow up safe, Andrew. They will grow up knowing who their father's brother really was and who he could have been." When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside the first one I had written before the canyon. This time, though, it was not a secret hidden away in case of tragedy. It was a goodbye, a bridge between past and future. One evening, Clara found me with the notebook still in my lap. She climbed onto the chair beside me, resting her head on my arm. "Grandma," she whispered, "do you think Daddy ever loved us?" The question pierced me. I wrapped my arm around her, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Yes, Clara," I said softly. "In his own broken way, he did. But sometimes love gets lost inside people. What matters is that you are loved now, and you will always be loved." She nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep, and I carried her to bed, tucking the stuffed rabbit in beside her. Ethan was already asleep, curled up under the quilt Harold's mother had made years ago. I stood in the doorway watching them breathe evenly and felt the first true peace I had known in decades. Later that night, Harold and I sat together on the porch. The sky stretched clear and wide above us, stars freckling the darkness. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "We lost Andrew," he said, quietly, his voice breaking. "We lost Caleb too. But maybe we can build something new with what's left." I leaned my head against his shoulder, the night air cool against my face. "We will," I whispered. "For them. For Andrew. For us." The rocking chair creaked gently. The night wrapped around us, and for the first time in 25 years, I no longer felt like I was waiting for the truth to rise. It had been spoken, justice had come, and love, though battered, had found its way back into our home.